I hope you can hear me. I had a professor when I was a freshman in college who taught me a fascinating lesson. In fact, he was a very well-renowned professor. So I had a professor when I was an undergraduate who was a very well-renowned professor. I had the last class that he taught before he passed away. And he explained a version of history to me which was a revelation by teaching me a historical fact in one sentence, which is that from the time of Jesus Christ and the Roman roads until the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, the wheel did not turn any faster. And that's a fascinating lesson that really helped me understand history in a new way. And in fact, ever since the existence of the wheel and our attempts as humanity to improve it, we as human beings have tried to find better and better ways to disseminate information. And technology has greatly helped in this process of conveying information from one generation to the other. Very early on in our history, we used to convey information about how to construct these things called wheels and how to use them. And over time, wheels were improved and they could move faster and faster. And wheels are, as many would argue, some of the most useful things in the world. But they have limitations. Wheels don't help rescue people that are stuck on a mountain after an avalanche. Not accessible. Wheels don't enable us to travel halfway around the world in less than a day. Wheels aren't particularly useful in navigating bodies of water. And so technology, if it is only used to incrementally improve upon something that has come before, won't be able to create a step change. And in fact, thinking about where we want to go from where we are is limiting. The greatest examples of technology and technological innovation aren't ones where human beings thought about how to make incremental improvements. It came from a source of idealism. Thinking about how the world should be. Forgetting constraints, forgetting the barriers that currently exist. And then saying, how is it that if we had no constraints whatsoever, how could we achieve something totally different? And we at Minerva argue that in order to think about education correctly, we have to stop thinking about what universities, high schools, elementary schools, kindergartens, graduate programs have done for millennia. We have to go back to first principles, to what education should truly be about, especially given the fact that we today live in a world where disseminating information is free. Anybody can have access to any information anywhere in the world. And so the need for institutions to charge somebody, the student, the government, the taxpayer, the philanthropist, anybody, to say, I have access to information, pay me so I can tell you the secret of physics, is absurd and it's immoral. Information is a human right. It's something that every human being should have access to. But what's difficult, what requires expertise, what requires an investment, is understanding what it is that we can do with that information. How do we synthesize it? How do we apply it? How do we create something novel with it? By some accounts, this is what's known as wisdom. And when you think about the wise, when you think about our mythologizing of who gets wisdom, we usually think of a common characteristic of those individuals. Usually, certainly in English, when you say a wise something man or a wise something woman, that something is usually old. Wisdom, we believe, can only be attained with great age. And it's true that age is one of the few ways that we have figured out over time can provide wisdom. And the reason for that is that we are all equipped with a highly imperfect machine, which is our brain. And our brain isn't really built to be wise. Now, what is wisdom? Why does it take so long for people to attain it? Well, if you think about what makes an old person wise, it's generally because they have spent a lifetime of making mistakes. But what's interesting is that those mistakes oftentimes are the same mistake done over and over and over again. But they're done in slightly different ways. Maybe early on in their life, they want to pursue a person of the other gender that they would like to have a romantic involvement with and fail. And then they think about pursuing a career and fail. And then they perhaps try to enter into a business arrangement, which doesn't work as well as they expect. And then maybe later, they're raising a child and trying to teach them something and fail to convey what they really mean. And then maybe later on in life, after 30 years, 40 years of being married to another person, they really fail at communicating how much that person means to them. And then that person winds up leaving them. This series of failures will eventually inspire an aha moment in some people. And they'll say, wait a second. What I actually intended to say, I didn't say very well. It wasn't received correctly. I should think about the impact I'm having on somebody else as opposed to just my intentions. And when they attain this moment of enlightenment, they feel great. And then because it's taken them 60 years to figure it out, they drop dead. Because they're old. That's what happens when people get old. And so, in some ways, wisdom is wasted on the old. But it doesn't have to be. Educational systems can provide a similar set of learnings, taking concepts and contextualizing them in context after context after context until the brain understands general principles applied in many different areas. This core idea of wisdom, in our interpretation, is really the appropriate application of practical knowledge.
Let me repeat that because I think it's a very important concept. We believe that wisdom is the appropriate application of practical knowledge. And let's unpack what that means, and then let's think about how you can create an educational system that can actually teach it. So first and foremost is this concept of practical knowledge. What is practical knowledge? Well, it's very simple. It's information, knowledge that you can use. Right? Now, there's a lot of information out there in the world that is not usable. That doesn't mean it's not important. It just means that it may not be practical. Right? But in order to even utilize that kind of information, you need some kind of practical knowledge to be able to apply to it. So for example, you can read a poem. But if you don't understand the practical knowledge of how language is constructed, of meanings of authors, of symbolisms, of metaphors, well, it's going to be very hard for you to understand that poem. You are applying practical knowledge to the interpretation of a work of art. Right? Practical knowledge can, of course, be used in any field. But the key, the appropriate application, means that when you are faced with the need to use practical knowledge, you know what kind of knowledge to call upon and when and how to apply it. And so there are two elements that are crucial to be able to teach appropriate applications of practical knowledge. The first is a structured, or what we refer to as a scaffolded curriculum. Learning practical knowledge doesn't have to take decades, but it does take time. You must have spaced, deliberate practice in learning how to apply it, and that practice has to occur over multiple contexts over time. What is referred to as far transfer. A scaffolded curriculum means that you start with a base set of ideas, of concepts, of habits of mind, reactions, automatic reactions that your brain uses. And then you take this core set of elements and you scaffold it around a curriculum. Much like a building, when it is constructed, has to have a scaffold built around it. Eventually, as you layer that application of practical knowledge in context after context, year after year, the scaffold can be removed and the building remains standing. I'll give you a few examples, right? All centered around one of these ideas. So let's take a concept called sunk costs. Right? Sunk costs is a very standard concept that any university will teach in the world of business or economics. It's not a revolutionary idea. Everybody in the world of business or economics understands it. And so, in short, a sunk cost states that if you do an analysis in business, and let's say you're building a project, let's say you're building a new building, and the building is destined to be a restaurant. And so it will take 10 million yen to build this small little restaurant in the middle of a village. And you've spent 5 million yen in the process, and it turns out halfway through this project that if this building is completed, the restaurant and the building itself will be worth only 250,000 yen. But you still have, only 2 million yen. And you'll still have 5 million yen to go to finish the construction. Well, if the entire project is only worth 2 million, right, and you need to spend another 5 to get it built, it doesn't make sense to spend it. You'll lose 3 million yen. And the fact that you've already spent 5 million yen on laying the groundwork for this building is irrelevant. It has occurred in the past. It's referred to as a sunk cost. And so when you do your analysis, you have to ignore what you've spent in the past and only think about the incremental value of the project and the incremental investment that you have to make in it. This is the concept of sunk costs. Now, if you have a conversation with economists at universities, and you will ask them whether or not a university should be providing their lessons online versus in classrooms, it is remarkable how many of these economists will say, well, but we already own the buildings. This is a near transfer failure of sunk costs. It doesn't matter that a university has a campus or has a building. If the incremental cost of upkeep of the grounds costs more and produces less value than merely abandoning the campus altogether and teaching fully online, the university should abandon its campus. Right? That's a simple analysis of sunk costs. And this is what's known as near transfer, because it is still talking about an asset owned by an institution. It still looks at money that has been spent in the past versus money that is necessary to be paid in the future, and the value that that future investment will return. Right? And it's stunning how few corporations, institutions of any kind, truly understand sunk costs when it comes to analyzing their own operations. Now, at the same time, you can have a different conversation with that economist and say, hey, do you have perhaps a friend that you've had for many, many years who's just asked you for a favor? And this is one in a very long series of favors that they've asked you over these past 20 or 30 years. And you've been very accommodating for those favors. You've been helping them out, giving them loans, giving them advice. And this friend has never really returned any kind of favors back to you. In fact, every time you ask them for something, they say they're busy. Should you perhaps give this person more of your attention and time? Well, clearly the answer is no. Right? This is an individual who isn't particularly worthy of being a friend, that takes advantage of their position. But psychologically, we often think, well, I've spent so much time and energy with this person in the past, I should invest even more in the future. It's not relevant. It's a sunk cost. If you know that a friendship will not be mutual, it'll be unidirectional, right? You should cut that friendship off. That is a far transfer example of sunk costs. Now, this is not a context where you expect to apply economic principles, but one where they actually work. Because sunk costs isn't actually an economic principle. It's a general concept that you can apply in business, finance, economics, but also in interpersonal relationships, in government, in law, in many cases in nature and in biology. But so to truly understand sunk costs, if you learn it in the context of an economics class, at best, you'll be able to near transfer it to other economics or business-related topics. And the only way you have a shot at being able to understand sunk costs at its true conceptual level is to be able to contextualize it over and over and over again. Practice the appropriate application of that piece of practical knowledge. Right? And so a scaffolded curriculum, one that introduces these concepts, and the Minerva curriculum introduces about 100 of them. In their first year, right, the scaffolded curriculum enables each of these concepts to be contextualized and recontextualized over and over and over again until they become cemented in the brain. Now, in order to be able to do that, you not only have to create a curriculum that presents these elements, presents these ideas, and contextualizes them, but you have to make sure that students are engaged. What I am doing now is perhaps the worst possible way to convey this idea, because the lecture is simply not effective. A very well-known study, which kind of explains the root of understanding, was done many years ago. And the scientists or the experimenters brought two groups of subjects in, and they gave the first group of subjects a list of phrases. Phrases like microphone in hand, or person in chair, right? Or podium on stage. And in a timed fashion, they asked each individual in this group to memorize as many of these phrases as they can. They then brought in a second group and told them in the same amount of time to visualize each one of these phrases and memorize as many as they could. So visualize basically meaning to actually picture in their mind a microphone in a hand, right? A podium on a stage, etc. Well, it turns out those who were asked to visualize remembered about twice as many phrases as those who just were asked to memorize the phrase. And this is not particularly surprising. But what's really surprising was that there was a third group. And the third group was asked to come in, and they were just told in a certain amount of time to visualize each one of these phrases. But they weren't told to memorize any of them. And then, at the end of the time, the experimenters held a pop quiz. And they said, okay, now recall as many of the phrases as you can. It turns out that that third group could recall an identical number of phrases as the second group, which was told to visualize and memorize, and twice as many as the group that was told to memorize the phrases. And so what this proved is that asking someone to memorize, in fact, trying to memorize, isn't helpful at all. The only way for your brain to remember, way for your brain to actually learn, is for you to be deeply engaged with the material. And so if you've come in here and said, oh, I'm really curious about Minerva, I want to learn more, I'm going to listen to Ben Nelson speak, and I'm going to memorize what he says. No way, won't work. 6 months from now, even a week from now, most likely, if I ask you about the content of my speech, almost certainly you will have forgotten at least 90% of it, and that's for those of you who are really paying attention. You actually need to be fully engaged with what I'm saying, meaning you have to go through your own exercises. When I ask rhetorical questions, you have to start thinking about them and answering them, right, in order for you to actually be able to retain what I'm saying. And so in order to deliver a scaffolded curriculum effectively, in order to be able for students to learn 100 different habits of mind and foundational concepts and be able to transfer them from context to context, you must have a fully active learning environment. In a fully active learning environment, students must be engaged with the material as much of the time as possible. Professors are only allowed to provide context, speaking 3 to 4 minutes at a time. And then students have to be engaged at least 75% of the time for 100% of students throughout class. And that means working in teams, going through and assessing what other students are saying if they're not the primary ones speaking at the time, working on simulations, working on projects, all while applying what they've learned and processed before class. And that combination of having a fully active learning environment in a scaffolded curriculum can only be enabled with technology. And this is where technology comes in. Not because you've built a technology and you say, well, what can I do with it that will improve what I currently do? But instead, thinking about what has been up until now impossible. Think about how to teach 100 different concepts across 30 different fields of study over 4 years between 30 different professors. How is it possible? How can you have a student take course A and learn 50 ideas there, and then apply 10 of them in course B, right? And then 6 others in course C, and include other concepts from other courses, all intertwined, and have the professor know how well each of the students in their class is doing in each one of these elements, and change the class per the individual student to make sure that they ramp up as best as they each can on each one of these elements. How can that be done without the use of technology? How can that be done without the use of information? But this is effectively the approach that we at Minerva have taken. Go to first principles, think about what an education should look like, and then build the infrastructure to enable it. So at Minerva, we have a course catalog, meaning we have a total course offering of less than 100 courses. But we offer our students concentrations or major areas of study in 30 different fields with less than 100 courses, where each course traverses at least 2 different fields, and sometimes all 30, providing ideas and concepts that you can build on, that you can apply, and providing the groundwork for students to pursue their own level of inquiry and exploration with all of the content that the world provides them. That reimagining produces results in a few months that the best universities in the world have not been able to replicate across 4 years of study. And that is for the very first implementation of this idea. The Minerva curriculum, the Minerva system, is improved every single year. And the difference we see among the students who have gone through our curriculum in their first year versus the second year versus the third year of students that have come in has been remarkable. Imagine what it means for institutions that aren't reimagining what they do, when there will be other institutions that are. Institutions that are producing students that are graduating in their early 20s with the wisdom of those who've spent a lifetime acquiring it. Imagine what that can do for the world, and imagine how critical it is for the rest of higher education to find their own path in reimagining what education should be. Thank you.